Chaos, my friends, is a substantial feature in the Old Testament. Even a casual reader will observe a persistent pattern. There is order, then disorder, and then restoration. It happens repeatedly. A temple is built, then demolished, and then rebuilt. An army is defeated, and then with reversal of fortune, the losers overthrow their enemy. A people is lost, but then rescued, and then returned. We're familiar with this sort of progression. Most good stories follow this particular method. From classic children's stories to great works of literature. We also see it in movies, whether set in the Old West or even in outer space. There is typically a good beginning. All is well. Then there is an intrusion into this orderly space, usually by an evil force or malevolent person. All is shaken. Things are unsettled. Then there is an unexpected turn for the good, and then the reader or viewer is largely assured that good will ultimately prevail. And when all is made well, at the end of the book, or just prior to the credits, the reader or viewer feels satisfied and reassured and comforted. What happens in the small scale happens in large scale too. In fact, the whole Bible is much like a formulaic story. The Old and New Testaments frame a narrative that begins in Eden, descends into suffering, and rises to hope and salvation. Today, I urge you to reflect on humanity's quick descent into chaos. Let's start at the beginning. Now, as you know, the epic biblical battles between good and evil begins innocently enough. A formless earth is reordered into a garden of endless wonder, limitless bliss, and perennial delight. The Garden of Eden is a utopia, a lush and verdant place where God walked in the cool of the day and people were so innocent they did not know that they were naked. But soon something went seriously wrong. There's that intrusion. The first 2 chapters of Genesis are beautiful and poetic, but God puts one tree in that garden that is forbidden to them. Now, over the ages, many people have seen that as God's way of allowing Eve and Adam some measure of autonomy and choice. They are given the gift of freedom. They are not robots or puppets. They have free will. They are granted to make choices, and those choices would have consequences for good or for ill. But Genesis chapter 3 details their painful choice. The consequences of eating the forbidden fruit are vivid. Adam and Eve found themselves living east of Eden in a world where they must endure toil and sweat for one's bread, and pain and suffering in childbirth. They are banished from paradise forever. Now, some believe this event is more metaphorical than literal, but whether one sees this passage as more allegory than reality, one can still feel a palpable sense of shame and loss, despair and regret. And the troubled reader wonders, can an unblemished, unpoisoned, unspoiled, unbroken, undamaged Eden be restored? Will the narrative end happily ever after, or will humankind remain in terror, chaos, and disorder for eternity? But we pause here for a moment. Perhaps we move on too hastily. Perhaps we dwell in sin too prematurely. It's true that we seem predisposed to pass over original blessing and emphasize original and sin instead. So let's fix our thoughts on who we once were. We were once wondrously made, perfect, flawless, unspoiled, unblemished, uncorrupted. Made in God's image, we were in our ideal state, each of us possessing the likeness of God, each of us wondrously made, each of us uniquely equipped to be a part of the body, and each of us regarded as God's beloved. Now we tend to stress our flaws and shortcomings and imperfections instead. We're also inclined to ridicule and criticize and condemn others for theirs. We tend to wallow in self-loathing and self-recrimination, and we make others do the same. There is a better way. Quite simply, we can pause on original blessing rather than leap to original sin. We can see ourselves and others as God's cherished creation. Pastor Paul Mitchell will help us explore this because this love-starved and conflicted world would benefit if we did embrace this simple truth, that we, you and I, are beloved. Please stay tuned. Hi, this is Pastor Don Shipley, and I'm delighted to have my friend and colleague Paul Mitchell here. And Paul, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Paul. I'm the pastor at Vashon United Methodist Church. I'm in my 5th year here, and it's a glorious day. It's good to be
And
with you, Don.
indeed, it's a pleasure to have you. We talked prior to this interview about original blessing, which was new and unfamiliar to me. Can you kind of define what that is and explain that a bit for us?
I think a lot of Christian history and doctrine has been centered around the Augustinian idea about original sin,
Hmm.
and that has filtered or influenced the way that we look back at, especially the first chapter of Genesis, and we think about or the second chapter of Genesis, and we
Hmm.
think about the expulsion from Eden and the terrible thing that Adam and Eve did to set us up basically for sin and failure for the rest of history.
Right.
But I really appreciate how, at the end of that day of creation, in which God created the animals and the humans, that God looked on it and said, "This is good. This
Hmm.
is very good. Not just good, but very good." And that's the original blessing. That's the fundamental statement of God about creation, is that it is very good.
So, how is that understanding manifest in ministry and theology and Christian dialogue?
Well, it means that each and every person that we encounter is a part of that goodness of that creation, that there may be circumstances or experiences or systems that interfere with our goodness, with, I'll say, I use that word, fullness of life. Um, but we can always return to that.
Okay.
And that when we are our true selves, we know that we are beloved. So I think it plays out in pretty much everything that I do. Uh, it helps me to remember when I encounter someone that I'm struggling with, uh, uh, who I might want to, hold at arm's length or even
Mhm.
further, that there's something in them that God has proclaimed as being very good.
Well, that's certainly an attitudinal shift for people to imagine and see everybody with the same manner that God sees them, as God's beloved. But humanity tends to stress our shortcomings, our flaws. They exploit all those sorts of things. Why do you think, suppose humanity tends to do that?
I think, circumstances and systems uh, get in the way of us knowing our true selves. Uh, and so that may prevent us from seeing what's really good in us.
You said that you encountered this idea by reading a book of some sort.
I don't remember altogether how I came to this, especially to the phrase original blessing, but I understand that the theologian Matthew Fox has written extensively and has
Okay.
articulated this idea of original blessing.
These instant faith sessions that I record usually have a practical component to it. The practical part here is how do we go about shifting our attitudes, thinking, and practice?
Imagery and imagination can really help a lot. I think that ties into that idea of being made in the image and likeness of God, and part of God's image and likeness is imagination, imagining how things could be, how
Yeah.
things will be. One of my imaginings is there's an idea, I think it comes from uh, Kabbalistic Judaism, mystical
Mhm.
Judaism, an idea that each being, each soul has an angel that goes before them
Mhm.
and that announces, behold, a child in the image of God. Behold, a child in the image of God. And so when I'm encountering somebody that I'm having trouble,
Yeah.
trouble, like they're scary, that I can imagine there's that angel going before them, between them and me, announcing to me and anyone else that will hear,
Yeah.
behold, a child of God. Behold. a child of God. And there's that angel going before me as well, saying to them, behold, a child of God.
It would be nice for me to employ somebody that could just be walk before me and just shout with a megaphone, "Behold, here comes dawn! Behold, here's the beloved child," and and such. That would be
Absolutely. Make way for Prince
exactly,
Ali.
exactly. I'd like have
Aladdin, right?
red
You can
carpet and
imagine
trumpet
that
and the whole
the
bit.
genie going before you saying, make way for Don Shipley,
Exactly.
a child of God.
Yes.
If that voice is even for you, right? If
Right.
you are marching along through life and you can imagine that there is an angel, a genie, going before you and
Yeah.
announcing to all of creation, make way.
What is it about self-esteem that people struggle with it so valiantly?
Yeah, that fear of not measuring up to some kind of ideal is really powerful.
How is this sort of practice in a church? How can a congregation promote these original blessing ideas? Or has your church figured out a way to adopt this principle in some kind of concrete way?
I mean, I see it as partly my role as a pastor to be that angel for my congregation,
Hmm.
to announce to the community that the community is beloved of God, to announce to my congregation that they are beloved of God, and to just do that literally. It's my practice to call my congregation beloved.
Yeah.
That's how I address them, so that we rehearse that again and again and again.
We also spoke about fullness of life and an initiative around that. What are you doing, and can you describe that for us a bit?
There's this idea that what we want for everyone in and out of the church, everyone, is to experience life in its fullness. Many people who don't seem to be able to hold together all of the resources and relationships that they need for fullness of life all at the same time. One of the things that we hope to do with this project is engage different voices in the community and talk to them about how they see what is fullness of life for them. Would it mean for you to experience fullness of life? Because we don't presume that we know. So we need to figure out a way to ask, to come alongside people and say, are you experiencing fullness of life? And how could you? What would that be like for you?
Okay, so for instance, it could be the absence of meaningful relationships, for instance,
Right.
or it could be food insecurity could be an issue. And if they had a reliable source for food, then they'd have fullness of life. If they had shelter, for instance, or a meaningful job, are these the things that you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. An opportunity for creativity, for an expression of creativity,
Okay.
is another one. Um, we can easily forget that. Again, we're going back to that idea that being made in the image and likeness of the creator, if
Yeah.
we don't have an opportunity for creativity, then we're not living into our fullness.
I see how
Um,
we've gotten full circle here. Since we are God's beloved, equipped and empowered to do all sorts of things, and for whatever reason we haven't been able to exercise that, then we're not living a full life.
and again, we don't presume to dictate for someone what that is for them. I think one of the ways that we've been sort of kicking around as this kind of idea of evidence is from Galatians 5, where it talks about the fruit of the Spirit.
Mhm.
And if somebody is evidencing, showing love, joy, peace, patience, endurance, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self control,
Right.
this is evidence that someone is experiencing fullness of life
Yeah.
if they have these, fruits of the Spirit.
How's this practice in your church?
Well, we're just, it's a new project, but here's kind of what we're imagining, that
Yeah.
for for people that seem not to be experiencing this, um, that they may be accessing resources that they need, but those resources are often focused around the agency or the entity that's providing them.
Sure.
So you mentioned, for instance, hunger, food insecurity.
Mhm.
So they may be accessing the food bank, right? And the food bank is, to the extent that it can, uh, providing that resource. But that's the extent of what they provide. It's agency or entity centered. The same thing could be for the domestic violence organization, or it could be any of these things.
Yeah.
Um, but they're all centered around the agency or the entity. And what we are seeing is that individuals, people, or groups, maybe families, are not at the center of that. So we're thinking, how can we come around people that are not experiencing fullness of life, and help them to make those connections, but centered on the individual or the family, rather than centered on the agencies, which are all doing good work, but maybe that individual or that family is not connecting with them all in a kind of holistic way.
But at the same point, at the same time, your church is also an agency because it can provide companionship, support, encouragement, spiritual resources, and so on. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. I believe that's true. And we, to more or less, for better or worse, we have some experience and expertise doing that.
Mhm. Maintaining all confidences, of course. Do you have any testimony, any story about a person who was able to celebrate his or her original blessing or found fullness of life?
A lot of our churches have hosted recovery groups of one kind or another.
Sure.
And um, I think recovery groups are a great model for the church. I think we could learn a lot by emulating the recovery movement, the 12-step movement, even. And so I'm thinking right now of a particular person who began to, at sort of at the depth of their experience, as a last resort in their brokenness and addiction, sought out a group that was hosted in our church building.
Mhm.
And then began to feel beloved, supported, surrounded, and uh, began to also to attend some of our activities,
Mhm.
and then began to talk to me about how can we make what I have experienced available to more people. This sense, this feeling of being surrounded. That's one that I can think of.
You've already cited a Bible passage. I often ask people what hymns inspire you or encourage you.
I was just looking at, before we started this conversation, I was just looking at a hymn in the Faith We Sing, uh, called Womb of Life and Source of Being.
Yeah.
That's a really lovely one, uh, that I think, I love, water, river, spirit, grace,
Hmm.
flow over me.
Hmm.
I think that one's a beautiful one. It talks about being beloved, being filled with spirit, having fullness of life. That's a really, really important one to me.
Do you yourself love yourself in a manner not unlike how God sees you?
Um, yes, I do, and that comes and goes.
Hmm.
There's times when I think, oh man, but um, But
Or
yes, I do. That question makes me think of a time when I first had entered ministry in the church as a designated, pastor figure. I
Official.
was still in seminary,
Hmm.
but I was living in a parsonage that was away from the church that I was serving. And on a regular basis, a group of Seventh-day Adventists would come to visit.
Hmm.
And they came back again and again, usually a new person every time,
Hmm.
along with a trainer, because I think they figured out that I was going to be kind
Yeah,
to them.
sure.
But they would often ask me, they would often say, aren't you concerned about your immortal soul?
Mm.
And that helped me to be able to say, I'm not concerned about my immortal soul. I am beloved.
Mm.
I am beloved. I'm uh, a, in the hands of a beloved God. And I also have to admit that there are many people who have experienced more challenges and difficulties in life than I have, and they have been able to hold on to that. I have such um,
Admiration.
guard,
Hmm.
yeah, a respect for someone who has been able to hold on to that sense of being beloved, even in the face of great struggle. When I was in my freshman year in college, at the end of the second semester, I had one more final exam to take.
Yeah.
And I had the wrong time in my calendar. It was a handwritten calendar in those days, right?
Yep.
Uh, and so I went um, to the test all prepared, right, to
Right.
find an empty room,
Yeah.
and I was so distraught. At the height of my perfectionism, I had completely missed it,
You're
right?
at the apex of
Oh,
despair.
I was broken. I was so shaken, and went back to my dorm. And the dorm manager was a woman of prayer,
Mm.
and I I wasn't really comfortable with that, right?
With what?
But with the idea that somebody was just going to pray for me,
Okay.
like some person, right?
Right.
That I want that to be in its box, in its place.
That's
This wasn't the place for that. At the front desk of the dorm, when I had just missed my exam, I was distraught and I didn't want it. But she reached out and laid her hands on me and prayed for me. And the theology of what she was praying for was completely foreign to me. And so there's my little intellectual thing going at the same time saying, no, no, no. But at the same time, she was beloving me.
Yeah.
She was speaking to the beloved in me and seeking to give me healing and encouragement and life. And and so that part of me was able to accept that.
Well, this has been a rich conversation. I'm delighted to have you here to discuss these big ideas about original blessing and fullness of life. So thank you very much for taking some time with us. God bless you.
Thank you so much it's been a delight for me as well, Don.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Water, river, spirit.